This is just a sample of the audiobook. To get the complete audiobook, access the link posted in the first comment.
Did you know that modern-day Lisbon, the capital of Portugal, is the first European city built with seismic safety in mind? And there is very good reason for that. In 1755, Portugal was hit by an earthquake that would measure 9 on the future Richter scale. Portugal, which is located on the Iberian Peninsula, has a rich history that dates to prehistoric times. The first settlers left amazing art behind in the form of rock carvings and rock monoliths. These first peoples never left their country, but were integrated into the many societies that came to Portugal over time. They were Phoenician traders, Romans, Germanic tribes, Muslims from North Africa, and Hispanic peoples. This mix of ethnicities resulted in a unique language and culture of the medieval Kingdom of Portugal, and one might even say of the modern-day Portuguese Republic as well. Even though Portugal is probably best known for exploring the world during the Age of Discovery, the history of mainland Portugal is rarely described outside of the country. This is why the Age of Discovery is only briefly touched upon, as there are many other fascinating things to talk about instead that might be lesser known to listeners. The purpose of this audiobook is to familiarize English speakers with the events and personas that built the Portuguese kingdom, its overseas empire, and the state that Portugal is today. But rather than presenting dry facts, the chapters of this audiobook are interwoven with interesting facts and historical events that are little known to the world outside of Portugal itself. In this audiobook you will learn: who were the first people that inhabited the Iberian Peninsula? What was the early culture and religion of the peninsula? Which civilization first discovered the shores of Portugal? How did trade with the Phoenicians develop the culture of the indigenous people? How did the Carthaginian and Roman wars shape the Iberian Peninsula? Why did the Germanic tribes invade the peninsula? Did the Iberian Peninsula thrive under Islamic rule? Why did the Christian kings of the north launch the Iberian Reconquista? How did Afonso I form the medieval Kingdom of Portugal? How did the House of Avis rise to power and start the Golden Age of Portugal? Why has Portugal always struggled to preserve its independence? What role did the House of Braganza play in the restoration of Portuguese independence? How did the empire end? And how did Portugal become a republic? Here's an excerpt from the audiobook. Portugal has a very complex history that spreads all around the globe. The history of Portuguese discoveries, colonization, and trade guilds have been studied far and wide, but the history of mainland Portugal is often neglected. This audiobook will concentrate on the events that took place in the Portuguese mainland, which is a small country locked between the Atlantic Ocean to the west and Spain to the east. As the westernmost country in Europe, Portugal was regarded as a frontier nation, an outpost that was far from the European mainstream center of gravity. Although Portugal has only 2 neighbors, Spain to the east and the Atlantic Ocean to the west, Portugal can feel the closeness of Africa to the south, a continent that was once a danger and more recently a temptation. Thus it was Spain, Africa, and the opportunities presented with overseas voyages across the Atlantic that influenced and shaped the history of Portugal. But Portugal has no geographical distinction in the Iberian Peninsula. It was never a geographically separate region, and Portugal is made of the western extensions of the geographic regions of Spain. It is interesting how Portugal developed a separate culture, language, and political worldview from the rest of the Iberian Peninsula when it was just a small part of a very large geographical entity. Nevertheless, Portugal was one of the first European kingdoms with stable borders.